Soulframe buildcraft can be pretty complex, which is lots of fun when you get farther into the game and want to play around with what's possible, but if you're new, that can be a bit overwhelming. In this video, I'm going to teach you buildcraft basics, so no matter which pact or weapon you want to play with, you'll know how to build it well. The first thing to think about when making a build in Soulframe is what you want to build around. Do you have a favorite pact ability you want to boost? A favorite weapon you want to use? Or a favorite playstyle you want to build for? Any of those will work well as a starting point, but it will help to pick one to focus on. Let's start with the easiest, pact abilities. Each of Soulframe's pacts has 3 arcanics, or magics, or abilities. The game isn't totally clear exactly what they're supposed to be called, but let's call them abilities for now. Each ability scales with one of your 3 virtues, so the more points you have in that virtue, the more effective it will be. This can mean it deals more damage, lasts longer, reaches further, or all of the above. Each ability is different in how it works and what parts of it will scale, but in general, more points in that ability's virtue will make it better. So, if you want to build around a pact ability, your first step will be to put points into that ability's virtue. You can do this through the rebalance function in your arsenal, through pact upgrades, through equipping talismans, and through drinking virtue potions. You can favor more than one ability and divide your virtue points between them, and some pact abilities have interesting synergies that make this worthwhile, but because of some complex scaling interactions, this is much better on melee builds than on magic or bow builds. Weapons and armor also get stronger when you have more points in the virtue they're attuned to. For armor, this is pretty straightforward. Choose the best armor pieces you have that are attuned to the same virtue as the pact ability you're favoring. If you're not sure which of your armor pieces are best, just look at this number up here, which is your total armor rating. These smaller numbers are your individual armor ratings, and they can matter for some higher level content, but for most of the game, what you really care about is your total armor rating. Weapons get more complicated because of virtue scaling caps. Each virtue pip on your weapon represents 0.5 damage per point in that virtue that gets added to your total weapon damage, but this added virtue damage is capped for basic attacks. Blessing a weapon with joinery adds more virtue pips, so it increases the strength of that virtue's scaling, meaning you get more damage per point you have in the virtue you blessed it with. Virtue attunements cap out at 5 pips, or 2.5 damage per point in that virtue. Even grace attunements, which normally get an extra 0.3 damage per virtue point, still cap out at 2.5, and a maxed attunement will have this gold trim around the virtue pip. The total amount of damage you can get from virtue scaling has to do with that weapon's rarity and its base damage, and there's no easy way to see those stats in-game, but I'll put a link below to Springroll's spreadsheet if you want more information. If you're creating a dual virtue build to favor more than one pact ability, then your best bet is to use a melee weapon because then you can still maximize the damage you will get from that weapon. Choose a melee weapon that is attuned to both of the virtues you've spec'd into and add joinery to strengthen either of those attunements. This should result in solid damage, but make sure you're meeting that weapon's virtue requirement. If you don't meet a virtue requirement, then the weapon's virtue scaling will be disabled, which won't matter too much early on in Soulframe, but will definitely matter from mid-game onward. But let's say you want to favor a specific weapon and create your build around that. For melee weapons, this just means you put your points into whichever virtue or virtues that weapon is attuned to, but for bows and magic weapons, things get more complicated. Bows and magic weapons have fully charged attacks with much higher virtue damage caps, sometimes so high that they are hard to hit without buffs from teammates. Technically, melee weapons also have this extra scaling with perfect throws, but most of the time that's not how you're using melee weapons, whereas bows and magic weapons truly excel on fully charged builds. Because those damage caps are so hard to hit, you will definitely need to use joinery to strengthen the attunement of the weapon, and since you can only strengthen one attunement at a time, as of P15 anyway, this essentially forces you into a single virtue build if you want to maximize bow or magic weapon damage. You'll still need to meet your weapon's virtue requirements, so, for example, if you want to use Staff, you'll need both 8 Courage and 15 Spirit on your build to get the extra virtue damage from either virtue. In this situation, since the spirit requirement is so high, you're better off using just enough courage to meet the courage requirement than putting everything else into spirit and strengthening the weapon's spirit attunement. Because magic weapons and bows scale so much better on single virtue builds, you're also going to end up favoring the Pact ability attuned to whichever virtue your weapon is attuned to. With the choices we have in P15, this will mean your spirit ability for magic weapons and your grace ability for bows. So pick a pact that has a spirit or grace ability you like using if you want something good to pair with a magic weapon or a bow. Your virtues also affect your Envoy in a more general way through what I like to call Envoy scaling. This is likely to get tweaked in the future, so if you're watching this in Prelude 16 or later, check the pinned comment for updated info. But the short version is that Courage makes you really tanky, Spirit makes your Pact abilities recharge faster but also makes you very glassy, and Grace is supposed to make you into a glass cannon, but you're not really that glassy and more of a tactical nuke than a cannon. For now, it means that you can go all in on Courage and pick Courage-attuned weapons and armor if you want to play like a tank. You can go all in on Grace and pick Grace-attuned weapons and armor if you want to play like a rogue or a skirmisher. And you can go all in on Spirit and pick Spirit-attuned weapons and armor if you want to cast your abilities a lot and are good at avoiding damage. So you have your Pact, your armor, and your main weapon ready to go. Now you need a sidearm. Soulframe currently has 3 types of sidearm to choose from: magic wrist casters, short blades, and fly blades. Wrist casters pair very well with melee weapons because they offer some ranged utility for your build. Short blades are especially good with staves because they will let you parry and riposte, which staves can't do otherwise. Fly blades are good with any weapon since they can offer both ranged utility for melee and some protection while casting or shooting when they're orbiting you. You do want to make sure you meet your sidearm's virtue requirements if you plan to use them for damage, and thus would want the virtue attunement to match your main weapon's attunement as closely as possible. But you can also use sidearms primarily for utility, in which case the damage scaling doesn't matter as much. The Pact upgrades you want on your build will mostly depend on which Pact you're using. The upgrades that give you more virtue points or let you carry more health potions will always be helpful, but otherwise it really depends what you're playing and how you like to play it, so that goes beyond buildcraft basics. Fortunately, you can reset your upgrades anytime you like, so go ahead and experiment with different options to see what feels good with how you play. Combat arts, on the other hand, do have a few staples that are almost always worth investing in. Riposte and Spectre Strike are excellent mechanics on any weapon that can get them, and I love being able to parry heavy attacks with Unyielding. Increased charge rate for bows and magic weapons is a must, and while smite chance isn't as critical now as it used to be, it's still always helpful. Finally, let's talk runes and totems. Most of our runes are pretty good in P15, so use whichever ones you like. Mistscale can be a bit tricky to aim, and Flitsmoke's duration is a bit short, but they're still decent runes in some situations. They're just not as easy to use as Everflame and Embrot. Totems are in a weird place right now because some of them are definitely doing a bit too much. If you like explosions, then there are several totems that cause explosions of damage, blindness, or stagger around yourself or your enemy whenever you pull a smite. And since both your main weapon and sidearm totems are active at all times, you can put on all of those totems between your 2 weapons plus Spreading Sploot, which will cause smite procs to multiply. The end result means a single smite proc in a group of enemies leads to a massive chain of explosions. While this is pretty entertaining, I don't actually enjoy this style of combat, so I prefer to use totems like Dabble Dredge, which gives me a nice heal when I pull smite, Smiting Stag, which gives me a higher smite chance when I have banked rune charges, and Far Foul, which increases my pull smite range, although that last one you will probably want to switch out for Quick Dray on melee builds for increased attack speed after a pull smite. Totems also have virtue attunements now, which means if you put a totem in the slot that matches its attunement, its strength will scale with your points in that virtue, but you can put a totem in any slot even if the attunement doesn't match and you'll still get the base bonus. Some totems are also specific to certain grip types, but those are pretty rare and don't do anything different from universal totems. They're just a bit stronger and can only be equipped on weapons in that category. And that should be plenty to get you started for beginner buildcraft in Soulframe. Choose a Pact ability, weapon, or playstyle you want to build around, Match your virtues to the ability, weapon, or style you chose. Equip items that will scale with those virtues. Take the Pact upgrades and combat arts that give you the enhancements you want. And use the runes and totems that feel most comfortable for how you play. We'll get into some more advanced builds in future videos, especially once we get that temper customization update, but in the meanwhile, this should help you make sure you're building well no matter how you like to frame your soul. If you did find this helpful, please toss it a like. Let me know in the comments what you like to base your builds on, and until next time, happy hunting!